The Galactic Council had ruled the known universe for 3,000 years, and nobody questioned their authority. 12 elder species sat on the council, and they made all the rules that mattered. Every species that wanted to travel between the stars had to pay tribute. Every species that wanted to trade with other worlds had to pay tribute. Every species that wanted protection from pirates and raiders had to pay tribute. The system was simple, and it had worked for longer than most civilizations could remember. When humanity appeared on the galactic stage, the Council noticed them immediately. These newcomers from a star system called Sol had somehow developed faster than light travel in just 30 years. Most species took 200 years or more to figure out how to break the light barrier. The humans were different, and that made the Council nervous. Different meant unpredictable, and unpredictable meant dangerous. Ambassador Vexther of the Krell hegemony received the assignment to handle the human situation. He was old even by Krell standards, and he had welcomed 47 species into the galactic community. Each time had been the same. The new species would be amazed by the size and power of the Council. They would see the massive fleets and the ancient technology. They would hear the tribute demands, and they would agree, because what choice did they have? Vexther expected the humans to follow the same pattern. The meeting took place on Convergence Prime, a massive space station that floated in neutral territory between several major star systems. The station was ancient and beautiful, built by the Council founders when they first united the galaxy under one rule. Its halls could hold thousands of beings from hundreds of different species. Today, those halls would witness what Vexther assumed would be another routine submission. Captain Daniel Hayes commanded the human diplomatic vessel that docked with Convergence Prime. He was 43 years old, and he had spent half his life in space. His hair was starting to gray at the temples, and he had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much. Next to him walked Linda Morrison, the chief negotiator for Earth's government. She was younger than Daniel, maybe 35, with sharp features and sharper intelligence. Behind them came Commander Jack Bennett, a military advisor who rarely smiled and never joked. The three humans walked through the grand entrance hall of Convergence Prime and tried not to look impressed. The ceiling stretched up so high, it seemed to touch the stars themselves. Holographic displays showed ships from 1,000 different worlds coming and going. Beings of every imaginable shape moved through the crowds on their own business. This was the heart of galactic civilization, and humanity was about to learn what being part of it would cost. Vexther waited in Conference Hall 7, a room designed to make visitors feel small. The ceiling rose 50 feet above the floor. The walls displayed images of the Council's greatest victories and most prosperous worlds. At the center of the room stood a table made from crystal, harvested from a star that had died before Earth's sun was born. Vexther sat on one side of that table. His scales were deep purple, and they gleamed under the artificial lights. His eyes were large and golden, and they had watched empires rise and fall. Daniel, Linda, and Jack took their seats across from the ambassador. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Vexther was using an old negotiating technique, letting silence build pressure until the other side felt compelled to speak first. But the humans just sat and waited. Finally, Vexther opened the conversation. The tribute assessment had already been calculated by the Council's economic analysts. Humanity currently controlled 17 worlds, including Earth. They had a combined population of 8 billion. Their technology level was rated as emergent. Their military capability was classified as minimal. Based on these factors, the tribute would be 30% of their total economic output delivered annually. In addition, the Council would take exclusive mining rights to 4 of humanity's colony worlds. The colonies would be evacuated and turned over to Council operations. Finally, humanity would immediately cease all independent military research and development. Any new weapons or defense systems would require Council approval before construction. Vexther explained all of this in a calm, reasonable voice. He had given this speech so many times he could recite it in his sleep. The tribute was not a punishment, he said. It was the price of membership in galactic society. The Council provided protection, technology sharing, and access to markets spanning hundreds of worlds. In return, they asked for a modest contribution to maintain the peace and stability that everyone enjoyed. Linda listened to the entire presentation without changing expression. Jack's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Daniel stared at the crystal table and wondered how many species had sat in this exact spot and heard these exact words. When Vexter finished, Linda spoke first. Her voice was polite but not warm. She told the ambassador that humanity would need time to discuss these terms with their government. This was a decision that would affect billions of people, and it could not be made lightly. Vexter's membranes flickered, which the humans had learned meant something like amusement. He told them they had one standard cycle, which translated to about 26 Earth hours. After that, the council would expect an answer. He also mentioned, almost casually, that compliance was not optional. Every species paid tribute. This was the way things worked. This was the way things had always worked. The human delegation returned to their ship without speaking. The corridors of Convergence Prime seemed longer on the way back. Other species moved past them, some nodding and greeting, some ignoring them completely. Everyone here had already accepted council rule. Everyone here had already bent the knee. Once they were back aboard Freedom's Call, the ship that had brought them to this meeting, Daniel sealed the conference room and activated the security protocols. No transmissions could get in or out. No surveillance could record what they said. The three humans sat around their own table, much smaller and less impressive than the crystal one they had just left. Jack spoke first, and his voice was angry. 30% of everything Earth produced. 4 entire worlds stripped of their people and handed over to aliens. Complete control of their military development. He said it would turn humanity into slaves in everything but name. Linda agreed, but she was more analytical. She pulled up data on her tablet showing what had happened to other species that refused council demands. The results were not encouraging. The council had weapons that could crack planets. They had ships that made human vessels look like toys. They had been doing this for 3,000 years, and they had never lost. Daniel stood and walked to the viewport. Outside, Convergence Prime rotated slowly against the background of stars. Somewhere on that station, Vexter was probably already preparing his report for the council. He would tell them that the humans seemed cooperative. He would predict easy compliance. He would be wrong. Daniel turned back to his team and told them to open a secure channel to Earth, Priority Alpha, which meant only the highest levels of government could access it. He told Linda to start drafting their response. She asked what response, and Daniel smiled for the first time since the meeting. He said they would give the only answer that free people could give. The message went out on quantum encrypted, channels that would take 6 hours to reach Earth, while they waited for a reply. The three humans prepared for what was coming. Jack reviewed the defensive capabilities of their small fleet. Linda researched council military tactics and looked for weaknesses. Daniel wrote letters to his family, just in case. On Earth, alarms started going off in government buildings across the planet. The message from Freedom's Call had triggered every emergency protocol. Within an hour, the Global Assembly was being called into session. Representatives from every nation began arriving at the United Nations complex in Geneva. Nobody knew exactly what the council had demanded, but everyone knew it was bad. The priority level alone told them that Secretary General Martin Cole read the message 3 times before he believed it. 30%. For worlds, complete military control. He was 61 years old, and he had led humanity through first contact 5 years ago. He had guided them through the shock of learning they were not alone. Now, he had to guide them through this. The Global Assembly chamber filled with voices arguing in 24 languages. Translators worked overtime to keep everyone on the same page. Martin Cole sat in the center chair and watched humanity's representatives debate the future of their species. Some wanted to accept the council's demands. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to try negotiating for better terms. The arguments went in circles for hours. General Patricia Evans stood at the main podium and waited for silence. She commanded the Earth Defense Force, which sounded impressive until you realized it was only 30 years old. Patricia was 52, and she had spent her entire military career preparing for threats that might come from space. Now that threat was here, and it was bigger than anyone had imagined. She spoke plainly about what humanity faced. The Council had weapons that could destroy entire planets. They had ships that moved faster and hit harder than anything humans had built. They had been fighting wars when Earth was still in its Stone Age. If this came to battle, humanity would lose. She did not sugarcoat it. She did not offer false hope. The numbers were clear, and the numbers were terrible. Representative Luis Martinez from the South American Union jumped to his feet before Patricia finished. Ahea, he asked if she was suggesting they just surrender. His voice carried anger and frustration. Patricia met his eyes and said she was suggesting they understand reality. Understanding your enemy was the first step in defeating them. But she was also being honest about the odds. Director Henry Walsh spoke next. He ran the colonial administration, which meant he was responsible for every human living off Earth. 6 million people spread across 16 colony worlds. Most of those colonies were small and poorly defended. If the Council attacked, those people would die first. Henry's voice shook as he described what evacuation would look like. Where would they go? How would they move 6 million people before the Council fleet arrived? The logistics were impossible. The debate continued through the night and into the next day. Coffee and energy drinks kept the representatives awake. Staff members brought food that nobody ate. Outside the chamber, billions of people watched the news and waited for their leaders to decide their fate. Karen Phillips represented the North American Federation, and she was the youngest person in the assembly. At 39, many of the older representatives dismissed her as inexperienced, but Karen had done her homework. She had spent the last 6 hours reviewing every piece of information they had about species that joined the Galactic Council. When Karen finally got the floor, the chamber had been debating for 18 hours. People were exhausted and tempers were short. She walked to the central podium and pulled up a holographic display that everyone could see.
The display showed
A timeline of 40 different species and when they joined the Council. Karen pointed to the data and started explaining what she had found. Every single species had negotiated from weakness. Every single species had paid the tribute. And every single species had remained subordinate to the Council for generations afterward. Some had been paying for 800 years, some for over 1,000. Once you accepted that first tribute demand, you never stopped paying. The Council made sure of that. Karen's voice grew stronger as she spoke. She talked about humanity's history. They had survived ice ages when they barely had fire, had rebuilt from wars that killed millions. They had faced pandemic diseases and climate disasters and economic collapses. Humanity's defining characteristic was that they did not give up. They did not surrender. They found a way forward even when the path seemed impossible. She proposed something different. Send the Council a message they had never received before. Not a negotiation, not a plea for mercy, not a request for better terms. Just a simple refusal. One word that would tell the galaxy that humanity would not bow. The chamber erupted in shouts. Half the representatives loved the idea, half thought it was suicide. Martin Cole called for order, and it took 5 minutes to restore quiet. Then he called for a vote. The proposal was simple. Should humanity refuse the tribute demands with no conditions and no negotiations? Yes or no? The voting took 20 minutes. Each representative had to register their choice on a secure system. When the count finished, the display showed the results. 147 in favor, 38 against, 15 abstentions. Humanity had made its choice. Martin Cole felt the weight of history settle on his shoulders. He opened a secure channel to Captain Daniel Hayes on Convergence Prime. Daniel's face appeared on the screen looking tired but alert. Martin delivered the news in simple terms. The Assembly had voted to refuse. Their response to the Council would be one word: no. Daniel nodded slowly. He had expected this outcome. Humanity had not come this far just to surrender at the first threat. He asked Martin to confirm the exact wording one more time. Martin repeated it. One word. No, nothing else. No explanations, no justifications. Just a flat refusal. Back on Convergence Prime, Daniel gathered his senior staff in the conference room. Linda Morrison had already started drafting the official response. It took her less than 5 minutes because there was not much to write. Commander Jack Bennett reviewed their security protocols and made sure their escape route was clear. If things went bad, they needed to get off this station quickly. Lieutenant Amy Carson handled communications, and she looked nervous. She was 26, and this was her first major assignment. Now she had to deliver a message that might start a war. Daniel told her to breathe and focus. All she had to do was her job. Amy nodded and prepared the transmission package. Linda finished the document and showed it to Daniel. It was perhaps the shortest diplomatic message ever written. One paragraph of formalities stating that humanity had considered the Council's proposal, then one word in large, clear letters, no, that was it. No legal arguments, no requests for more time, no counteroffers. It's just refusal. Jack asked if they should prepare weapons. Daniel shook his head. Weapons would not help them here. The Council wanted them dead. 43 warships could vaporize their little diplomatic vessel in seconds. Their only defense was the hope that the Council would want to negotiate rather than kill ambassadors. The meeting with Ambassador Vexter was scheduled for noon station time. That gave them 3 hours to prepare. Daniel spent that time writing messages to people back home. Linda reviewed her notes on galactic law and custom. Jack checked and rechecked their ship's systems. Amy practiced her breathing exercises. When the time came, they walked back through those grand corridors to conference. Hall 7. Other species moved through the station on their daily business. Nobody paid attention to 3 humans heading to what might be their execution. The galaxy was very good at ignoring things that did not concern them. Vexter was already waiting when they arrived. His scales had shifted to a lighter purple, which their briefing said meant he was in a good mood. He probably expected good news. He probably expected humanity to fall in line like everyone else. He was about to be very disappointed. The ambassador gestured for them to sit. His golden eyes moved from Daniel to Linda to Jack. He asked if humanity had made its decision regarding the tribute assessment. His tone suggested he already knew the answer. Everyone always agreed. This was just a formality. Daniel stood instead of sitting. He held the data tablet containing their official response. Linda and Jack stood beside him in a show of unity. The room seemed very quiet suddenly. Even the air circulation system seemed to hold its breath. Daniel looked directly at Vexter and spoke clearly. He said that humanity had carefully considered the Council's demands. They had consulted with their government. They had consulted with their people. They had searched their conscience. And they had reached a decision. He handed the tablet to Vexter. The ambassador took it with one clawed hand. His eyes scanned the screen. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his scales flushed dark crimson. His membranes stopped flickering. He read the message again, as if he could not believe what he was seeing. Vextar looked up at the humans, and his voice came out cold. He asked Daniel to clarify the statement. Was humanity requesting modified terms? Daniel shook his head. No modifications, no negotiations, no tribute, no surrender of sovereignty. The answer was simply no. The room erupted into chaos. Other council delegates who had been observing from the side chambers rushed in, demanding to know what was happening. Vexter stood to his full imposing height of nearly 8 feet. His voice rose to a threatening hiss. He told Daniel that humanity was making a catastrophic error. The tribute system maintained peace and order across the galaxy. Without it, there was only chaos and war. Daniel met his eyes and did not look away. Said humanity would take their chances with chaos. They'd not clawed their way out of the gravity well of Earth just to surrender to the first empire that demanded submission. Humanity was done here. The 3 humans turned and walked out of Conference Hall 7. Behind them, they could hear Vexter shouting orders in his own language. They could hear other delegates arguing frantically. None of it mattered now. The message had been delivered. The die had been cast as they hurried through the corridors back to their ship. Linda caught Daniel's arm. She asked if he really thought they would survive this. Daniel kept walking and said he had no idea, but at least they would die free. The silence in Conference Hall 7 lasted exactly 3 seconds before Ambassador Vexter found his voice again. He demanded that the human delegation return immediately. Daniel Hayes heard the announcement over the station's communication system, but kept walking. Behind him, Linda Morrison and Jack Bennett matched his pace. They did not run, but they did not slow down either. They reached their docking port in 10 minutes. Freedom's Call sat waiting with engines already warming up. Lieutenant Amy Carson had prepared the ship for immediate departure the moment she saw their response document. Smart girl. Within 5 minutes of boarding, they were clear of Convergence Prime and accelerating toward the system's jump point. Daniel opened a priority. Channel to Earth as soon as they were away from the station. Secretary General Martin Cole appeared on the screen, looking like he had aged 10 years in one day. Daniel reported that the message had been delivered. Vexter had not taken it well. The Council was giving humanity 72 hours to recon Cider before they would respond appropriately. Martin asked what appropriately meant. Daniel said it probably meant warships. General Patricia Evans joined the transmission from Space Defense Command orbiting Luna. She had already started mobilizing every military vessel humanity possessed. It was not much. 30 years of spaceflight had produced 42 combat-capable ships. The Council probably had more ships in their border patrol than humanity had in total. But Patricia was not planning to fight a conventional battle. She had other ideas. Martin gave the orders that everyone expected, but nobody wanted to hear. All colony worlds would receive defensive weapons and fortifications. Every human settlement would prepare for attack. No evacuations. If the Council wanted to take human worlds, they would have to fight for every meter of ground. Jack Bennett nodded approvingly. Guerrilla warfare was something humans understood very well. The 72 hours began counting down. On Earth, people watched the skies and waited. Some cities held prayer vigils. Some held protests demanding the government's surrender before millions died. Most people just went about their lives because what else could they do? Fear was useful only if it motivated action. After that, it just became noise. Admiral Gregory Kane commanded the Earth Defense Force fleet from the bridge of EDS Defiance. The ship was humanity's pride and joy, their largest warship, with enough firepower to crack a small moon. It was also completely outmatched by Council technology. Gregory was 61 years old, and he had commanded naval vessels for 40 years before joining the Space Force. He knew when he was outgunned. He also knew that being outgunned did not mean being beaten. His executive officer was Commander Lisa Chen, a tactical genius who had written 3 books on space combat theory. She stood next to Gregory, studying the holographic display that showed their defensive positions. Earth sat in the center, surrounded by layers of orbital platforms and missile batteries. The fleet formed a protective shell around the planet. Mars had its own smaller defense network. The outer colonies would have to fend for themselves. Lisa pointed out that the Council would expect them to defend Earth above all else. That made Earth the obvious target for the main assault. Gregory agreed but said they had no choice. 8 billion people lived on that blue planet. They could not leave it undefended. Lisa suggested a compromise. Defend Earth, but make the Council pay for every kilometer they advanced. Bleed them. Make them wonder if this conquest was worth the cost. On Mars, Colonel Sarah Martinez oversaw the defense preparations for humanity's oldest colony. 3 million people lived in domes and underground cities across the Red Planet. Sarah had spent 15 years on Mars, and she loved it more than Earth. This was home. The Council wanted to take it, and she would die before letting that happen. Her aide, Lieutenant Kevin Ross, brought reports of civilian volunteers forming militia units. Farmers and miners and teachers were learning to use weapons. Sarah felt pride mixed with sadness. These people should not have to fight. They should be building their new world in peace. But the galaxy had other plans. The hours ticked by slowly. On Convergence Prime, Ambassador Vexter held emergency meetings with the Council leadership. Some members wanted immediate military action. Crush this upstart species before they inspired others. Some wanted economic sanctions. Cut them off from galactic trade and let them starve in isolation. A few voices suggested negotiation, but they were quickly shouted down. The Council had never negotiated with tribute refusers because there had never been tribute refusers. Vexter sent multiple messages to Freedom's Call demanding that Captain Hayes returned for further discussions. Daniel ignored all of them. There was nothing left to discuss. Humanity had spoken. Now they would live or die by that choice. 72 hours and 14 minutes after the deadline began. Lieutenant Amy Carson detected massive subspace distortions on her sensors. She ran the analysis twice to be sure before reporting to Daniel. Multiple ships were incoming. At least 40 signatures. Probably more hiding behind the first wave. The Council fleet had arrived. Daniel gave the order that every human had been waiting to hear. Sound general quarters, battle stations, and broadcast on all frequencies a simple message. We do not surrender. We do not submit. We are humanity. The Council fleet emerged from faster than light. You travel at the edge of Sol System in perfect military formation. 43 warships ranging from destroyers to a massive dreadnought that made Earth's largest ship look like a child's toy. Admiral Gregory Kane watched them appear on his tactical display and felt his stomach tighten. This was really happening. The Council broadcast on standard frequencies. Vexter's voice filled every bridge and command center across the human sphere. He announced that humanity had refused lawful tribute demands. Therefore, the Council was authorized to bring them into compliance by force. All military vessels must stand down immediately. All FTL technology must be surrendered. The human species would accept Council administration. They had 1 hour to comply. Gregory looked at Commander Lisa Chen and asked her to draft their response. Lisa smiled grimly and typed out a short message. She showed it to the Admiral before sending. It read simply, "Negative. We are humanity. Come and take it." The message went out on all channels. In that moment, every human in Sol System and on every colony world heard their military telling the most powerful force in the galaxy to go to hell. Some cheered. Some cried. Some prayed. But everyone felt a surge of pride that their species would not go quietly. The hour passed in terrible silence. Both fleets held position. Weapons were charged, but nobody fired yet. This was the last moment when peace was possible. After the first shot, there would be no going back. The galaxy held its breath. On Earth, Martin Cole sat in his office, watching the fleet positions on his screen. His secretary brought him coffee that went cold on his desk. His wife called to say she loved him. His children sent messages from their homes across the planet. Everyone was saying goodbye, just in case. General Patricia Evans coordinated the ground defenses and made sure every colony commander was ready. Each one reported impersonally. Each one confirmed they were prepared to fight. Some of them would die in the next few hours. Patricia knew that. They knew that. But not one suggested surrender. When the deadline expired, Vexter spoke again. His voice was colder now and held no trace of the diplomatic courtesy from before. He said humanity's refusal was noted. They had chosen extinction over submission. This would be recorded for all species as a lesson. Defiance of the Council ends only one way. The Council fleet began moving forward, slowly at first, then faster. An intimidating advance meant to break enemy morale before the fighting even started. Admiral Gregory Kane watched them come, and his finger hovered over the weapons release authorization. Just a little closer. Wait for it. Make every shot count. The two fleets closed, 2 weapons range. Targeting computers locked on, missile tubes loaded. Energy weapons charged to full power. The Council dreadnought powered up its main batteries, massive cannons that could vaporize a city with one shot. Human ships prepared to fire everything they had, and then something impossible happened. Ship dropped out of FTL space directly between the two fleets. It was enormous, twice the size of the Council dreadnought. Its design was unlike anything either side had ever seen. Smooth curves and strange angles that hurt the eye to look at. Power readings that made no sense. Every targeting computer on both sides locked onto it, automatically. The newcomer broadcast on all frequencies in a voice that sounded like music. "This is Captain Nira of the Ven Confederation. All vessels will cease hostile actions immediately." Vexter's confusion came through clearly in his response. The Ven were neutral observers who had been absent from galactic politics for 2 centuries. This did not concern them. Why were they interfering? Captain Neera's response was calm but firm. The then Confederation had been monitoring the Council's tribute system for a very long time. They had been watching humanity's development with great interest. And they had decided that this particular injustice ended today. Vexthor demanded to know if the Ven were really willing to go to war with the entire Galactic Council over one primitive species. Captain Neera said if necessary, yes. But she suspected it would not come to that, as if responding to a signal. More ships began dropping out of FTL, 5 vessels from the Zephyron Collective. The crystalline species that had watched humanity's refusal at Convergence Prime, 12 ships from the Tauran, species nobody had heard of before, then more. Species after species appeared until 40 additional vessels filled the space around. Sol System. Admiral Gregory Kane stared at his tactical display in disbelief. Commander Lisa Chen grabbed his arm and whispered that they were not alone anymore. Daniel Hayes watched from Freedom's call and felt hope for the first time in days. On Earth, billions of people saw the fleet sizes suddenly become even, and they dared to believe they might survive. Captain, Neera spoke again, and this time her words were broadcast across the entire galaxy. Many species had grown tired of Council dominance. Humanity's courage had inspired others to stand up. The tribute system had oppressed the galaxy for 3,000 years. Today it ended. The Council faced a choice: withdraw peacefully and accept that their age of tyranny was over, or begin a war they could not win. The standoff in Sol System stretched into its first hour with nobody moving and nobody backing down. 3 separate fleets floated in the darkness of space, with enough firepower between them to destroy a dozen planets. The Council fleet held position near the system's edge. The human defensive line surrounded Earth, and Mars, the Ven, and their allies formed a protective barrier between the two forces, Admiral. Gregory Kane kept his hand near the weapons console, but did not give the order to fire. Commander Lisa Chen monitored the communication channels and reported that the Council ships were sending encrypted messages back to their home systems. Vexthor was asking for instructions and probably not liking the answers he received. On Freedom's call, Captain Daniel Hayes opened a channel to the Ven flagship. A face appeared on his screen that was hard to describe. Captain Neera looked almost human, but not quite. Her skin had a faint luminescence, and her eyes were larger than they should be. When she spoke, her lips moved, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere. At once Daniel thanked her for the intervention and asked why the Ven had chosen to help humanity. Neera smiled and said they had been waiting 3,000 years for someone to say no to the Council, waiting to see if any species possessed the courage to stand against tyranny. Humanity had answered that question. Now the Ven would make sure humanity survived long enough to inspire others. The second hour passed, and then the third. Ambassador Vexthor continued transmitting urgent quests to the Council's central authority on their homeworld of Krell Prime. The messages went back and forth with increasing urgency. Finally, after 6 hours of tense silence, Vexthor broadcast a new message. His voice had lost its threatening edge, and now carried something that sounded almost like weariness. He announced that the Council proposed an immediate ceasefire negotiations. All parties would meet on neutral ground to discuss a peaceful resolution. Daniel looked at Linda Morrison and saw his own surprise reflected in her expression. The Council was backing down. Secretary General Martin Cole received the news with cautious relief. He immediately assembled a negotiating team, but insisted on leading it himself. This was too important to delegate. General Patricia Evans wanted to keep the fleet at battle stations, but Martin overruled her. "Show good faith," he said. "Give peace a chance to work." The negotiations were held on a neutral platform called Gateway Station, built jointly by 5 minor species who wanted a place to trade without Council interference. The station was small compared to Convergence Prime, but it had the advantage of being truly neutral territory. No Council warships patrolled nearby. No tribute collectors demanded payment at the docks, Martin. Cole led the human delegation with Linda Morrison as his chief advisor. General Patricia Evans came as military counsel. Captain Daniel Hayes attended because he had started this whole situation. Ambassador Vexter represented the council, but he was not alone. Representatives from all 12 council species attended, along with observers from 20 other species who wanted to see how this played out. Captain Nira of the Vend sat at the main table as a mediator. She made it clear that the Ven would enforce whatever agreement was reached. Any species that violated the treaty would face consequences. Her massive flagship remained in Sol System as a reminder of that.
Promise.
The first day of negotiations accomplished almost nothing. The council representatives argued that the tribute system had maintained peace for millennia. Without it, chaos would consume the galaxy. Smaller species would be conquered by larger ones. Pirates would raid unprotected worlds. The careful balance of power would collapse. Martin listened to these arguments with growing frustration. Finally, he stood and addressed the entire assembly. He said the council was confusing peace with oppression. Yes, there had been no major wars between council species, but that was because the council crushed anyone who might challenge them. They called it peace, but it was really just the quiet of subjugation. A representative from the Zephron collective chimed in with their musical language. The translator rendered it as agreement. The Zephron had paid tribute for 800 years. 800 years of watching their best scientists work on council projects instead of their own. 800 years of sending their resources to enrich other worlds. 800 years of being told they were members when they were really subjects. Other species began speaking up. A delegate from the Tauran talked about how their military had been dismantled as part of their tribute agreement. They had no way to defend themselves if the council ever turned hostile. A representative from a species called the Dren described how their most talented young people were required to serve in council administration, effectively taking their future leaders away. The floodgates had opened. Species after species that had quietly accepted council rule for generations suddenly found their voice. They talked about treaty terms that favored council members, trade agreements that extracted wealth while giving little in return, technology sharing that only went one direction. The tribute system was revealed not as a fair price for services, but as institutionalized exploitation. Vexter and his fellow council representatives tried to defend their system, but the argument was slipping away from them. The second day of negotiations saw more species arriving at Gateway Station. Some came to support the council. Most came to support reform. The balance of power was shifting in real time. On the third day, Martin Cole proposed something radical. Abolish the tribute system entirely. Replace it with voluntary cooperation and mutual trade agreements. Create a new assembly where every species had an equal vote, regardless of size or military power. Make decisions through consensus rather than dictation. The council representatives rejected this immediately. Such a system would be chaos. How would disputes be resolved? Who would enforce the peace? What would stop powerful species from dominating weaker ones? Martin had answers for all of these questions, but the council was not really listening. They were calculating how much power they would lose. Captain Nira intervened on the fourth day. She announced that the Ven Confederation would guarantee the new system. Any species that attempted to conquer or dominate others would face Ven intervention. The council had maintained order through threat of force. The Ven would do the same, but in service of freedom rather than control. The negotiations continued for 3 weeks. Admiral Gregory Kane kept the human fleet at ready status throughout. Colonel Sarah Martinez maintained defenses on Mars. Every colony commander stayed alert. The fighting had been avoided, but the crisis was not over. Slowly, painfully, an agreement took shape. The tribute system would be abolished immediately. All existing tribute agreements would be voided. Species that had been forced to cede territory or resources would have those returned. The Galactic Council would be dissolved and replaced by the Galactic Assembly, where each species held one vote. The hard part was enforcement. The new assembly would maintain a joint defense force with ships contributed by all member species. This force would protect against external threats and prevent internal aggression. The Ven would oversee this transition period until the new system was stable. Not everyone accepted the agreement. The Krell hegemony and 2 allied species withdrew from galactic society entirely. They closed their borders and refused to participate in the new assembly. Vexter resigned his ambassadorship and returned to Krell Prime in disgrace. A few hardline factions tried to maintain the old tribute system in their local regions, but they found themselves isolated and eventually collapsed. The formal signing took place on Gateway Station with representatives from 83 species in attendance. Martin Cole signed for humanity with hands that shook slightly. He was exhausted from 3 weeks of intense negotiation, but also proud. They had done it. They had changed the galaxy without firing a single shot. The document became known as the Covenant of Soul. It's named for the system where the confrontation had begun. It established principles of sovereignty, mutual cooperation, and voluntary association. Every species had the right to chart its own course. No species could be forced to pay tribute or surrender territory. Disputes would be resolved through arbitration rather than force. Daniel Hayes stood with Linda Morrison and Jack Bennett watching the signing ceremony. Linda observed that one word had led to all of this. One simple refusal. Jack said it was never really about the word. It was about the courage to speak it. Daniel agreed. Courage was contagious. Humanity had shown the galaxy. Defiance was possible, and others had found their own courage in response. Captain, Nira approached the human delegation after the ceremony. She told Martin Cole that the Ven had been monitoring dozens of species, waiting for one to stand up. Humanity was not the strongest or most advanced, but they had something others lacked. They had the willingness to risk everything for freedom. That quality was rare in the galaxy and precious. Martin asked how long the Ven would stay to enforce the new system. Nira said, at least a generation, maybe 2. Long enough for the new assembly to establish itself. Long enough for species to learn cooperation in Zid. Eid of domination. Then the Ven would return to their own affairs. She made it clear this was not a new empire, just a guarantee that the old empire would not return. The council fleet departed. Sol system on the 23rd day after their arrival. The ships left in small groups over several hours. Admiral Gregory Kane watched them go with mixed feelings. They had not become enemies, but they were not friends either. Time would tell which direction that relationship moved. Earth celebrated for 3 days straight. Every city held festivals. Fireworks lit the sky. People danced in streets and embraced strangers. They had faced extinction and survived. More than survived. They had won. Not through weapons, but through the power of standing firm in their principles. On Mars, Colonel Sarah Martinez allowed herself 1 glass of whiskey with her staff before returning to duty. The immediate threat had passed, but humanity still had work to do. Colonies to build, technologies to develop, a place in the galaxy to establish. The real work was just beginning. 5 years passed after the signing of the Covenant of Soul, and the galaxy continued to adjust to its new reality. The transition was not smooth and it was not perfect, but it was happening. Species that had paid tribute for centuries were learning to govern themselves again. The Galactic Assembly met monthly on Gateway Station to resolve disputes and coordinate mutual defense. Captain Nira and her Ven peacekeepers remained in the background, watching and occasionally intervening when old habits threatened to return. Captain Daniel Hayes chose to stay in diplomatic service rather than return to Earth. He became humanity's first permanent ambassador to the Galactic Assembly. His ship Freedom's Call was retired to a museum on Luna, where millions of visitors came each year to see the vessel that had carried humanity's refusal to the Council. Daniel now worked from an office on Gateway Station, handling the daily business of interstellar relations. Linda Morrison returned to Earth and accepted a position as a Secretary of Interstellar Affairs, a newly created role in the Global Assembly. She spent her days negotiating trade agreements and cultural exchange programs with dozens of species. The work was exhausting, but rewarding. Every agreement signed was proof that cooperation worked better than coercion. Commander Jack Bennett took command of the Earth Defense Force's contribution to the Joint Galactic Defense Fleet. He led a squadron of 12 human ships working alongside vessels from 30 other species. The force was still small compared to what the old council had maintained, but it was growing. More importantly, it answered to the Assembly rather than to any single empire. Secretary General Martin Cole served one more term before retiring at age. He spent his final years writing a history of First Contact and the crisis that followed. The book became required reading in schools across human space and was translated into 40 galactic languages. Martin wanted future generations to understand that freedom always came with a price, but that price was worth paying. General Patricia Evans continued to command Earth's home defense forces and train the next generation of officers. She established a military academy on Mars where humans and aliens studied together. The curriculum focused on defensive tactics and peacekeeping operations rather than conquest. Patricia believed the galaxy had seen enough war. Now it needed guardians of peace. The Galactic Assembly grew from its initial 83 members to over 100 in those 5 years. Species that had been isolated or oppressed under the old system joined eagerly. A few former council species remained outside the Assembly, bitter about their lost power. The Krell hegemony still refused all contact with the outside galaxy. Occasionally, their ships were spotted at the edges of known space, but they never engaged. Humanity established 7 new colonies in those years, bringing their total to 23 worlds. Each colony had full autonomy under Earth's federal system. Some colonies specialized in agriculture, some in mining, some in research. Liberty Colony was founded in the 3rd year after the Covenant and dedicated to the principles of freedom that had guided humanity through the crisis. Its capital city was named Defiance, and its spaceport was called Courage Terminal. Ambassador Daniel Hayes received a message one afternoon from Captain Nira, requesting a meeting. They met in a small cafe on Gateway Station, a place where beings from dozens of species gathered to eat and talk. Nira ordered something that looked like tea but glowed faintly blue. Daniel stuck with coffee. Nira told him the Vin were preparing to withdraw from active peacekeeping. Not immediately, but within the next 2 years. The Galactic Assembly had matured enough to handle its own security. The Joint Defense Force was functioning well. Most importantly, species were resolving disputes through negotiation rather than force. The new system was working. Daniel asked if the Ven were concerned about a return to the old ways. Nira admitted the possibility existed, but said the galaxy had changed fundamentally. Too many species had tasted freedom. Too many had learned cooperation. The tribute system could only work when everyone believed it was inevitable. Humanity had shattered that belief. Now everyone knew that defiance was possible, that unity could defeat tyranny. She also told Daniel something that surprised him. The Ven had been watching humanity since humans first developed radio technology. They had observed the world wars, the nuclear age, the space race, everything. The Ven had seen other species at similar developmental stages, and most had destroyed themselves or stagnated. Humans kept pushing forward despite setbacks. That resilience had convinced the Ven that humans might be the catalyst the galaxy needed. Daniel asked why the Ven had not intervened earlier. If they opposed the Council system, Nira explained that intervention from outside would not have lasting change. The galaxy needed to reform itself from within. The Ven could provide protection during the transition, but the choice to change had to come from the species being oppressed. Humanity had made that choice and given others the courage to follow. The 10th anniversary of the Covenant arrived with ceremonies across the galaxy. Gateway Station hosted the largest gathering with representatives from every assembly member. Martin Cole came out of retirement to give a speech about the early days of the crisis. General Patricia Evans received the Assembly's highest civilian honor for her role in preparing humanity's defense. Captain Nira spoke briefly about the future and expressed confidence that the galaxy was ready to stand on its own. The most moving moment came when delegates from the Zephron Collective presented humanity with a gift. They had crafted a monument from their own crystalline bodies, a process that required 800 individual Zephron to contribute small pieces of themselves. The monument stood 30 feet tall and displayed images from the Confrontation and Soul system. At its base was inscribed one word in 50 languages. No. Daniel Hayes stood before the monument with tears in his eyes. Linda Morrison, who had come from Earth for the ceremony, put her hand on his shoulder. Jack Bennett stood on his other side at attention. The three of them had been in that conference room when they drafted the response. They had walked into Vexer's presence not knowing if they would walk out alive. And they had delivered a message that changed everything that night. Gateway Station held a festival unlike anything seen before. Music from 100 cultures mixed in the air. Food from 1,000 worlds filled the tables. Beings of every imaginable form danced and celebrated together. The old council had maintained order through fear and separation. The new assembly celebrated unity through voluntary cooperation. Daniel found himself in conversation with a young delegate from a species called the Mentor. They had only recently achieved spaceflight and joined the assembly the previous year. The young delegate told Daniel that her species had studied humanity's history carefully. They were inspired by the courage humans had shown. More importantly, they were grateful that someone had stood up to tyranny before the Menthar reached the stars. Because of humanity, her people would never know the burden of tribute. Daniel told her it was not just humanity. The Ven had intervened. The Zephyron had stood with them. The Tauran and dozens of others had found their courage at the crucial moment. No single species had changed the galaxy. It took all of them working together. That was the real lesson. Years continued to pass. Daniel served as ambassador until he was 60 and then retired to write his own memoirs. Linda Morrison eventually became Secretary General of Earth and guided humanity through 2 decades of prosperity and expansion. Jack Bennett rose to command the entire Joint Defense Fleet before retiring to teach at Patricia's Academy on Mars. 50 years after the Covenant, humanity's colonies numbered 87 across 40 star Psi. Stems. Earth's population had declined slightly as people spread across the stars seeking new opportunities. The exodus was voluntary and celebrated. Humanity was becoming a truly spacefaring species. The Galactic Assembly grew to include 173 member species. The Joint Defense Force had intervened in 3 conflicts over the years, always successfully and always with minimal casualties. The force fought to separate combatants and enforce ceasefires, not to conquer. Every action was approved by assembly vote and monitored by independent observers. The former council species gradually rejoined galactic society. The Krell were the last to return, 103 years after their withdrawal. They sent Ambassador Vexther's grandson to negotiate their readmission. The younger Vexther publicly acknowledged that the tribute system had been unjust and pledged his species to the principles of the Covenant. The Assembly voted to accept them with only 5 dissenting votes. On the 100th anniversary of the Covenant, Gateway Station held another massive ceremony. None of the original participants were still alive. Daniel Hayes had died peacefully at 97, surrounded by family. Linda Morrison lived to 101 and worked until her final year. Martin Cole's great-grandson represented Earth. At the ceremony and read passages from his ancestors' history book, the monument given by the Zephyron still stood in Gateway Station's central plaza. Millions of beings passed it every year. Most stopped to read the inscription and learn the story. Parents brought children and told them about the day humanity said no. Teachers brought students to discuss the nature of courage and justice. The monument had become a pilgrimage site for those who valued freedom. A human historian named Professor Helen Carter gave the keynote address at the centennial celebration. She talked about how one moment had changed the trajectory of galactic civilization, not through violence or conquest, but through moral courage. Humanity had not been the strongest or most advanced species. They had simply been the first to say what needed saying. That act of defiance had rippled across the galaxy for a century, and would continue rippling for centuries more. She ended her speech with a quote from Daniel Hayes, written near the end of his life. He had said that humanity's greatest contribution to the galaxy was not technology or art or military prowess. It was the example of standing firm in your principles, even when the cost might be everything. That example had inspired 100 civilizations and freed trillions of beings. One word spoken at the right moment in the right way could change the universe. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for all those who had made the Covenant possible. Then music began, and the festival started. 100 years had passed, but the celebration was the same. Beings of every species, gathering in voluntary unity to honor freedom and cooperation. The galaxy would face new challenges and new threats, but it would face them together as free beings rather than subjects of empire. Somewhere in the archives of Earth, carefully preserved in climate-controlled vaults, sat the original data tablet that Daniel Hayes had handed to Ambassador Vexter. The message on that tablet was still readable. One word in simple letters: no. That word had been spoken in defiance, in courage, and in hope. It had echoed across the stars and into history, and it would be remembered as long as free beings looked up at the night sky and dreamed of what was possible.